Welcome back, my fellow patriots, to the Save Our Republic daily video series. We're getting back to the Constitution. We're now going to go on to the third Reconstruction Amendment, which is Amendment number 15. It was adopted in 1870. It's very simple and extraordinarily important. It states, Section 1, the right of citizens of the United States to vote should not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Section 2 provides the Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. So this is the amendment that gave all citizens that were men the right to vote. And notice it doesn't use the word men or women or anything like that, but at the time it was universal that only men, and I don't want to say universal, there may have been an exception here or there, but there were almost certainly vast swaths of the country, only men had the ability to vote in 1870 in both federal elections and state elections, and this was intended to take off the table any kind of discrimination against men in connection with the right to vote. So not just African American men, not just freed slaves, but Chinese and Catholics and anybody else, they all had the right now to vote. This it was an interesting amendment for a couple of reasons. First, of course, was that it really was intended to put to rest the idea that African American men or other racial or other religious minorities, whoever, didn't have the capability and the wherewithal to vote, and the radical Republican Congress, which had adopted and forwarded this for ratification to the states, basically believed that there was a terrible civil war and that it was fought to not only free the slaves, which the 13th Amendment did, and it was fought not just to provide for the equal protection of the laws and due process of unalienable rights, and to create citizenship for everyone in the South, and that's what the 14th Amendment was about, but also to allow African American men and other racial minorities to be able to vote. And so that was a monumental step forward. It clearly did not wipe away the stains of slavery. It did not include women. I'm going to get to that in a second, but it was a tremendous leap forward led by the radical Republican Congress. Lincoln had already been assassinated, of course, so it was really Congress that was driving this forward. Ulysses S. Grant would have been president at the time, and this was a major accomplishment. It was eviscerated in great measure when the federal troops left the South, and in what many people believe is a corrupt bargain in the Tilden-Hayes election, in which basically Hayes was allowed, the Republican candidate, allowed to win the presidency, and Tilden lost, the Democrat, but on a kind of behind-the-scenes gentleman's handshake in a smoke-filled room, in which Hayes agreed that he would withdraw federal troops that were occupying the South. And when that happened, there was a great upsurge in connection with racial discrimination through what we now call Jim Crow laws, and a number of legal mechanisms to really deprive African American men of the right to vote. When they had the right to vote, there was monumental changes. They did exercise the right to vote. U.S. senators that were African American Republicans were elected. There were African American Republican congressmen that were elected. State governments had governors and others that were supported by African Americans, and there was a real shift in, at least in the legal portion in the political portion of rights down in the South. When the troops left, the protections left, the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan came in, there was reigns of terror, there were lynchings, it was terrible and dreadful. And of course, economic servitude continued as well. Eventually, separate but equal was a legal regime which took hold of the South and was affirmed by the United States Supreme Court in a really terrible, despicable decision. in which they said as long as you treat people equally, you can separate them. Of course, the separation never had equality, any kind of public accommodations, schools, train cars, whatever it might be, always was much worse for the African Americans than it was for those of European and Caucasian descent. And so that was a national travesty. The other main point I wanted to point out is it did not provide women the right to vote. That didn't happen until the 19th Amendment, which was ratified in 1920. There was a movement to give women the right to vote that had started back in 1848, and African Americans and women, many of them had bonded together to try to eliminate the scourge of slavery. The emancipation movement and the abolitionist movement often united with the women's suffrage movement. Not always, but often did. And when the 15th Amendment came up for a vote in Congress and elsewhere, the suffragettes were really hoping that women's suffrage would be included. There wasn't enough support, or at least there wasn't perceived enough support in Congress to get both women's suffrage and suffrage for African American men. And so the decision was made by the congressional leaders to move forward with the right to vote for African Americans, leaving women in the cold. And that really tore apart some of the coalition that had been previously joined together in connection with trying to broaden the promise of liberty and freedom for everyone. With the adoption of the 15th Amendment, we did help move forward in connection with our founding first principles of the social compact, because now African American men were, and all men were part of the social compact now. They had the ability to vote and consent to the government. It also reaffirmed unalienable rights, because they were able to exercise political rights, which they were denied before. And it also helped limit government, because the government couldn't run roughshod over the rights of African American men. And it also reinforced the idea, obviously, of equality, that founding first principle. That was the primary one that most people were focused on, but it really permeated throughout all of our founding first principles. The rule of law is supposed to apply to everyone. Everyone is supposed to be treated equally. That also strengthened that idea. So it fundamentally transformed, at least for African American men, where things stood in connection with the country. But again, women would have to wait until the 19th Amendment. Until next time, don't forget about America's Survival Guide at americasurvivalguide.com, Patriot Week at patriotweek.org, and the American History, Patriot Lessons, American History and Civics podcast. God bless you, and God bless America.